Hi everybody, good evening. Thank you all for making it out on such a rainy night. Brave souls here for intellectual engagement. I'm Jeremy. Some of you know me, some of you do not. I'm the director of the honors program here at SVA, and welcome to our latest in the Art and Politics lecture series. The Art and Politics lecture series more broadly has monthly events aimed at interrogating the intersections in these highly serious times of political realities, political transformation, and art. So welcome to one and to all. And I'm thrilled to be here today with this exciting round table. I guess we're technically at a rectangular table, but we'll have to just make do with that. So I'll just give a set of brief introductions, then we'll start with Sam for the evening. We'll get some responses, and we'll try to make it kind of more conversational, especially because we're all here from the rain. So let's all make sure to participate, pipe in, have the energy the situation demands. First, really pleased to have Sam Stein here. Sam is, I'm just giving very short bio, so all the people up here are wonderful and very highly qualified, and you should read many, many things by them. But just briefly, the reason I invited Sam is a geographer, as well as an activist, and I invited him because of his recent book, Capital City, Gentrification, and the Real Estate State, by Verso Press. And I was told Verso gave me permission to relay that it is 50% off at the moment, said book, if you
Get two.
Order it online. Yeah, stocking stuffer. But yeah, I saw actually at the Strand that like Cokeland, the book about Coke Industries, is like good for grandpa. I was like, okay. Who's grandpa? So anyways, Sam's book is a really able, telling, smart analysis of the power of real estate and its sort of imbrication of finance in shaping city planning and priorities and shaping the whole structure of New York City specifically, but more generally of cities across the country. And it's a sort of compelling read about the consequences for ordinary people of that power structure, and ends with ways of imagining transformation, both on the part of transforming the politics of cities and also transforming the roles that planners, and especially in Sam's book, might play in thinking about urban space and justice. Next to Sam, or Samuel, going by Samuel Stein, there's another Sam Stein out there, so we have to distinguish. Shellyne Rodriguez, who is an alum of SVA and a teacher on the faculty here, and is an activist and an artist of stature, and she has responded to Sam's book before in relationship to her anti-gentrification activism, and I thought to have her here to do that today, and also some about her work as an artist and the intricate interrelationship these days between artwork in cities and gentrification. And then finally, to my right is Georg Windeck, who has also been a faculty member here at SVA. He's an architect from Berlin and an educator and a writer himself. His book, Construction Matters, I recommend checking out, about the new techniques and materials that architects are working with these days. And Georg has, I think, a very sharp eye for what's been happening to architecture in New York and in other cities where he's worked, many of them. He's also taught at Cooper Union and other fine institutions in this city. So really pleased. Georg and I have taught together for some years in the past, and we haven't seen each other in a while, so nice to have you back. Okay, I think without too much further ado, there's a sign-up sheet going around, yeah, welcome, and thanks so much for coming. And let's give Sam a big hand.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for coming out on this terrible night. Thank you, Jeremy, for inviting me, and thank you both for being here with me. I'm going to talk a little bit about what's in this book, Capital City, Gentrification in the Real Estate State. And I think through the conversation, we'll think about how it relates to art and architecture in the city. So I think it's fairly universally recognized that we have a housing crisis in this city, that we have a housing crisis in this region, we have a housing crisis in this country, we even have an international housing crisis. This is recognized pretty much across the political spectrum. There isn't anybody who thinks that things are okay as they are, even if there's drastically different explanations of how it came to be, and therefore drastically different ideas about how we would get out of it. But to talk about the parameters of the crisis in this country, in this city, a little bit, we are seeing the rate of sale of homes, for the most part, going up pretty dramatically over the last 15, 20 years, though it's slowed down in the last couple. So homes are selling very rapidly, but they're not going to homeowners. The rate of homeownership is fairly low. The rate of absentee investment is higher than it's ever been. So when I was writing the introduction to the book, the latest data was from 2016, and that year we had a record high number of home sales to absentee investors. It was 37% of the homes that changed hands that year. And some of that is going to people who are maybe, retirees who don't have a great pension and need some sort of retirement strategy, and so they picked up a second home and they're renting it out. Those are the stories you hear about a lot. That is not the vast majority of what's happening. Companies like Blackstone, private equity firms, are buying out tremendous amounts of housing, especially after the 2008 financial crisis and mortgage crisis that precipitated that financial crisis. Global private equity firms are buying up tremendous amounts of the housing stock and renting it out at ever-increasing prices until they can sell it off. So renting is rising, and at the same time rents are rising, but our wages are not keeping pace. So wages on the whole are fairly stagnant, especially for the bottom half of the income brackets. And so people's wages are staying flat, but their rents are going up dramatically, which means that people are suffering from really terrible rent burdens. Rent burden meaning the amount of your income that you're paying for your housing. The federal government says that a normal or affordable rate of rent burden is 30%. So you should be paying 30% of your income. So a lot of our federally funded housing programs have residents paying 30% of their income as rent. Federal government pays the difference. It used to be 25, so we've already had an inflation in our standard of what people should be paying from 25 to 30, but it's 30. But a whole lot of people, most people in many places are not paying 30% of their income in rent, they're paying far more. And this is broken out really dramatically across racial lines, and as the country remains especially segregated, it's easy to see how this plays out. So in neighborhoods that are predominantly white, the rent burden, when I wrote this again, was 31%. So already past the point that the federal government thinks people should be paying. In predominantly black neighborhoods, the average rent burden was 44%. And in predominantly Latino neighborhoods, it was 48%. 48% of your income going to rent. And here in New York City, we have over 2 million people who every single month are paying a majority, more than 50% of their income as rent. So that's like a giant cash transfer from 2 million people's bosses to their landlord that they never get to see, of more than half of their rent, of their income. So the rent burdens are terrible. So of course, we have dramatic amounts of displacement as people can no longer afford their housing, but also dramatic amounts of homelessness. The official count for New York City is about 70,000, which is higher than it's ever been as long as we've been counting. And in all likelihood, that's not a comprehensive count. There is also crisis of homelessness around the country. It's slightly lower this year than it was last year, but again, it's really high. About 2 million people per year go homeless at some point during the course of a year in the United States. It's a tremendous number. There's an additional 7 million people who are living in precarious housing, doubled or tripled up with friends or family, living in basements that are not legally habitable. We've seen the return of shift bed housing in New York City, which really we didn't have since the Industrial Revolution. Shift bed housing is when you rent your bed for a shift. So you're not renting an apartment, you're not renting a room, you're not even renting a bed in a room, you're renting a bed for a few hours. And then you go off to work and somebody takes your bed and sleeps in it. We've seen the return of that form of housing for the first time in like 100 years in New York City. So things are bad. Things are really bad. And there is probably two most common explanations for why things are this bad. The first is a supply and demand mismatch in terms of the housing we have and the people who want to live in it. And there's truth in this. It's maybe a little bit overdetermined. People think that this explains everything. It doesn't explain everything, but it does explain some things. It's especially true if you kind of make it a little bit more sensitive and say the supply of housing we have does not meet the economic demands of the people who need it, right? So we do not have the right supply of housing in this city and many other places. Instead, we have a large supply of housing that is far too expensive for most of the people who need housing. So, okay, true. Also, people have a kind of cultural explanation of cities becoming cool places again, and young people straight out of college wanting to move to the city and seeing that as a marker of success, whereas moving to the suburbs or staying in a rural area is seen as not a marker of success. That's true too. But neither of these things to me is like a full explanation of what's going on, and the big missing piece of it is not just about the supply and demand of housing, but the supply and demand of finance capital searching for a place to go and make a lot of money. So there's a surplus of finance capital seeking returns, and over the last, depends how you want to mark it, but certainly 20 years, a lot of that capital has found its way into real estate. So at this point in history, real estate is valued at around $217 trillion. That's global real estate, not just the US. So all the land and buildings in the world together are valued at $217 trillion, which is an unfathomably high number. You can think about that instead as the value of all the gold that's ever been mined in history anywhere, all piled into one place. If you valued that, you'd still have to multiply it by 37 times to get the value of real estate right now. This is a tremendous amount of money. And because it's that much money, it also means it's that much of the world's capital concentrated in one sector. So we're talking about 60% of the world's hard assets are invested in real estate. So if it's invested in something you can touch, there's a 60% chance that it's real estate. There's a lot of money that you can't touch, right? That's in financial derivatives and stuff like that. A lot of that is also in real estate. And we certainly know that after the 2008 financial crisis. And there have been other times in the history of capitalism where that high a percentage of global capital has been invested in land. But in previous eras, it was invested in intensive agriculture for the most part, or in industrial uses. What's remarkable about this moment is that it is invested in housing. Of that $217 trillion, 75% is housing. And at this moment, approximately 80% of the world lives in cities. So we're specifically talking about urban housing as the driver of global finance capital. That's a historically unique occurrence that I think says a lot about how we got to the point where we have 2 million homeless people in this country and all the homes are for sale and nobody's buying them. Who's going to live in them? Yes, it's about supply and demand. Yes, it's about cultural norms, but it's definitely also about this surplus of finance capital looking for a place to go. And so there's a lot of explanations for how that money got to be there and why it's going to real estate. In the US, we had tremendous amounts of deregulations that allowed for this kind of concentration of capital. It used to be hard to do that scale of real estate buying and selling. Those rules were changed in the 80s and again in the 90s, opening up tremendous opportunity for speculative real estate investment. During the Obama era, we also had quantitative easing, which released a ton of money into the bank system at a time when you were not making any money by saving it. Treasury bonds weren't paying off much of anything, and so intensive real estate speculation became the way that a lot of those banks used that free money. There's also a polarization of economics in general, where the global 1% is hoarding a ton of cash. When they have that much money, they're looking for something to do with it, and they generally want to spread it out geographically, just in case anything should happen geopolitically that they're concerned about. And so buying up real estate all over the world is kind of a smart way to deal with that problem. Real estate is also tremendously undertaxed in this and many other countries. And so if you're making your money off of capital gains rather than off of income, you can save more of that money and not share it with the public. So for all of these reasons and more, we've seen a ton of money move into real estate, and it's wreaked havoc on our housing markets in our cities as a whole. And this didn't, as the last thing I said just sort of suggested, it didn't just happen in the economic world and then sort of fall on us as residents of the city. All of it was political. So there had to be decisions that got made in various scales of government, from the local to the international, that allowed for this transformation to occur. And I talk about the kind of confluence of state power and real estate power in the book as the creation of a real estate state, which is in line with the way that we talk about there being a carceral state, which is the element of the state that's concerned with policing and locking people up, or the welfare state, the element of the state that's concerned with both the social control of and social reproduction of the poor in a society. That's the welfare state. So now we have the real estate state. The real estate state is the element of government that's concerned with making sure that the real estate industry is dealt with and that land and property values are always going up. Or at least that policy is geared toward that end, whether or not it works, because most of the time it doesn't. So we have the rise of this real estate state. I think you can see it particularly at the local level, though it exists at every level, right? We have a real estate developer for the president right now, so obviously there's something to that. But at the local level is where we do most of our physical planning in the United States. In other countries, that's not necessarily the case, but here it is. If we're going to make a decision about what gets built where, it's going to have more to do with municipal politics than it is going to do with state and federal politics. So that means that local real estate capital is very involved in local politics. And certainly here in New York City, we're familiar with that dynamic. Real estate has been the greatest donor to our political campaigns for a very long time. Real estate is the greatest buyer of media advertisement also, so that creates a sort of perverse incentive, especially in the newspaper business, to have, for example, a real estate section. Why should there be a real estate section in the newspaper? Why is there not a tenant section, for example, or a housing section? No, there's a real estate section. The answer is because they buy full-page glossy ads for their shiny new real estate developments. And we've had, in this last century, a kind of nice experiment in having a conservative and a liberal mayor who had very different styles of describing their approaches to housing and planning, and remarkably similar actual approaches to housing and planning. Many of the same assumptions carried over from the Bloomberg administration to the de Blasio administration, despite a dramatic shift in the way that they were discussed, and also despite a lot of other things changing, right? So it's not that nothing changes, but this thing remains fairly constant, even if the sort of exterior parameters of it change. The only economics class I've ever taken was taught by a guy named Jamil Moudoud, who described capitalism as a rock surrounded by putty. And the putty is flexible. It can do a lot of different things, but there's always this rock in the center of it that is unchanging. And that's kind of the political economy of real estate in New York City. There's a lot you can do around the edges, but until we blow up that rock, it's basically the rule. And so in the book I describe kind of how that continuity played out, and its roots in planning really going back to the 60s, but also I have a history of planning that goes back to the colonial foundation of this country. But there's also a what the hell do we do about it section at the end. Because the point of this is not to get depressed and think, oh my God, my rent is due any day now. It's to think about what we could do to change this fact. And I structured that section in 3 parts. And the first part is basically policies that cities, states, federal government could be pursuing right now. And some pieces of them are being done in different places, but for the most part, this is the road not taken. And it's things that are completely legal under the current constitutional order. They would require some laws to change, but no constitutional amendments. And they don't unmake the fundamentals of capitalism either, which is not to say that we shouldn't unmake the fundamentals of capitalism, but just to say that there are actually things that could be done right now that it would at least partially alleviate this situation, so that we don't fall into this, well, there's nothing to be done, or this idea that like there's now and there's the revolution, but there's nothing in between. So there's a list of policies which range from, if we need to increase the supply of housing, why do we keep doing it in the poorest areas? Why don't we, actually encourage development in the parts of the city that are wealthy and exclusionary, rather than channeling it into the poorest areas, which is what we've been doing for the last couple decades in this city. Why don't we expand public housing rather than forcing it to, die a slow death? Why don't we look at the community land trust model and take it seriously rather than have it be kind of window dressing on other gentrification plans? Why don't we flip the way that we do taxation so that speculation is taxed heavily, rather than giving a huge amount of tax giveaways to homeowners, including many hundred times more that we give to only the wealthiest homeowners in tax deductions than what we spend in public housing around the country. So there's a lot of things we could be doing now. Then I say, okay, forget about capitalism. Like, what does an actual socialist program around housing and planning look like? And what could we do if we socialize land? If land was no longer considered a commodity, just like everything else? What if we socialized planning? What if it was democratically controlled by the people who build the city rather than those who own it? What if we broke out of the every city plans for itself model and instead thought regionally and along ecological lines that actually make sense? Watersheds, for example, floodplains, rather than having, New York City planned separately from Nassau County and Westchester County and Newark, New Jersey and Jersey City and, every city for itself. How can we break out of that really constricting way of thinking? And then finally, there's a section on what kind of politics would drive us in that direction, and what can planners do right now? Because I'm an urban planner, I'm trained as a planner. I do believe in planning. This is not an anti-planning book. This is an anti-conventional planning book. It's a pro-alternative planning book. So what can planners do? And the answer is there's some stuff that they could be doing, but they cannot lead the movement. There's no way. They're way too constrained in their roles. And so the real power is in the tenant movement, which has been rising and gaining in courage, I think, in this city over the last few years, which is a really excellent development, and has been a feature of city politics really as long as this has been a city. Mm-hmm. But we've never really lived up to the full potential of a tenant movement in this city. We're like 66% of the population. We should be running everything. So we can think about it as a tremendous enemy that we're up against, a $217 trillion industry. But we can also think, okay, this $217 trillion industry has invested a tremendous amount of debt into the proposition that our housing will get perpetually more expensive, and we will take it or we will leave. We will either pay more of our income in rent, or we will move and someone will replace us and they will pay that rent. If tenants can shut down that system through rent strikes, through rent control legislation, through shutting down luxury developments, all that stuff, you actually throw a wrench into a system of global capital that is not prepared. There would be tremendous amounts of debt that would go unpaid, and it would cause a rippling crisis throughout the entire capitalist system. which, if we're not prepared for it, just means misery for everybody. But we can get prepared, and we can be ready to take over those buildings after the private equity owners default. And we can, actually take power in this city to the extent that our numbers should already allow us to. So that's the analysis and the vision that I laid out in the book. And thank you all for coming and listening.
Yeah, Sam. Yeah, I met Sam, like 2 years ago, more or less? So I'm Shellyne Rodriguez, and I am an artist. I teach here in the Visual and Critical Studies department. Shout out to Visual and Critical Studies. And I'm also a community organizer. I organize with a group called Take Back the Bronx, and we've been in formation since about 2011. We started as Occupy the Bronx. It was a bunch of heads from uptown who were interested in destroying the 1%. And when that project, I don't want to say failed, because I don't think it failed. When it ended, people from the Bronx said, yo, let's go back uptown and take care of our home. And very quickly, we understood that the words occupy, first of all, occupy on Lenape land is a no. But the Bronx is already occupied by the NYPD. And so we changed our name to Take Back the Bronx. So a little bit about Take Back the Bronx, and I'll say something about Take Back the Bronx, and then I'll say something about myself as an artist. And then I think I will say a few things about what it means to be an artist within the context of what Sam laid out so perfectly. For Take Back the Bronx, we started mostly around doing anti-police brutality stuff. Really, it was just presenting itself one after the other. It kind of parlayed into Black Lives Matter movement, and we had the death of Marley Graham kind of like happen on our watch. So we really began there. We slowly trickled into doing anti-gentrification work. I want to say about 3 going on 4 years ago. Again, just really responding to what's happening in the environment. For us, police violence and gentrification goes hand in hand. So just to give you an example of why and what that looks like, let's take Port Morris in the Mott Haven section of the Bronx as an example. Port Morris faces Harlem across the water, so it's a waterfront. This is the area that was famously called the Piano District by the developer that won the rights to that parcel of land to build on the waterfront. A developer by the name of Keith Rubenstein. So one of the things that Take Back the Bronx could be credited for is making developers' names famous. We made Keith Rubenstein's name famous. We made him a household name, made sure everyone knew what he looked like so he could get heckled when he walked down our neighborhoods. So Keith Rubenstein acquires this land, and last I checked, he sold it to Brookfields. This land is located, I want to say maybe 10, 15 minutes away from a park, St. Mary's Park. Now, if you know anything about the Bronx, everybody knows the Bronx is the birthplace of hip hop culture. This is should be a World Heritage Site for the birthplace of one of the greatest avant-garde art movements our generations have ever seen, that's for sure. St. Mary's Park would be one of these places where a lot of this happened. St. Mary's Park has been dilapidated for a really long time until Keith Rubenstein came into the picture. Now, the city found $30 million to renovate this park through the Anchor Park Initiative. Let's put that on the side for a second. Let's move in the opposite direction of that same location, which is the waterfront property by Keith Rubenstein, right? The other side is the 40th precinct. Everybody hates the 40th precinct for good reasons. 40th precincts now, there is an announcement. I wrote about this a couple years ago. It was about $50 million. That precinct was getting a new precinct built by Georg Windeck, who builds avant-garde architecture. You can probably say something about that.
But he's a developer also.
He
presents himself as an artist, but he's a developer. He's from a developer family.
From a developer family,
Yeah,
look at that.
yeah.
So Georg Windeck's building a new police precinct. Build as like state-of-the-art, green, and community-friendly police precinct. $50 million price tag on that. Sam and I just looked right before this talk started. It's up to $68 million now. So that's a new luxury development, which was, I believe, 2 25-story towers, right? 2 25-story towers. Rents beginning at $3,500. Beginning, right? You've got a park on the other hand, $30 million. That's not Keith's money, that's the city's money. The other side, you got $68 million for a new glass, state-of-the-art, with a green roof, police precinct. $68 million, city's money. Y'all see where we go with this? If you don't, I'll paint the picture for you. That's what I do. I paint pictures. So the state and the private sector go hand in hand. The developers, I mean, it's a classic tale of neoliberalism, right? Your only job here as the state is to make this easy for us to come and do what we need to do to make money. So if with a $3,500 beginning price tag for this new development, you want somebody to pay that. Well, they want to know if there's a dog run in the neighborhood where they can walk their dogs, and if there's coffee. So one of the other things that Keith Rubenstein has done was to start the name of his company is Somerset Group or Somerset Properties. He started a side business called Somerset Hospitality, where he funds businesses like coffee shops, restaurants, sort of create the environment around his real estate, right? A lot of things happening there. But to get to my point, the most important thing that he does is that he makes sure that the city invests in a robust new precinct. Now, if you're getting a new precinct, you're not just getting a new precinct. We all know from all of the protests at the Whitney Museum the last year that NYPD spent $7.3 million in buying ballistic equipment from Warren Kander's company, Safariland. So we understand that a lot of money gets put into this. So Take Back the Bronx tries to hold all these things together and to address them on a local level. For us, that's tenant organizing. We are currently organizing. We have 2 buildings. We're really focused on one right now. That's the one that seems to be doing the most. But it's a Section 8 building, which if you know anything about Section 8 or what Ben Carson is doing with HUD right now, it's a nightmare. But tenant organizing, getting people to break the alienation and talk to their neighbors and find out what's going on with you. So that's the micro of what Take Back the Bronx does. Very boring. Everybody's like, take back the Bronx. They're so badass. And we're like, no, we're not. We're boring. We're like mostly translating English to Spanish. We're like Dominican moms who don't know how to email their landlord, The macro is fighting rezonings. So if you don't know what a rezoning is, I can break it down real quick. Rezoning is basically, that's everything that I said about like the park and the precinct and the development. Rezoning is basically the rules how the city makes that happen. So there's an area, and there are certain rules along this stretch of land that says you can only build this type of shit here because it's residential or commercial, and that's it. Well, the city said, well, developer comes and says, I really want to build some luxury shit here. Here's like a check. All of a sudden, oh, you know what? We need to revisit what gets built here. That's called a rezoning. So the city does a song and dance where they do what's called listening sessions or visioning workshops with people in the community, where they say, oh, you want better services? You want your parks to be nicer? Yeah, you want better food quality. Oh, you say you need housing. Perfect. We got it. They go back and they come back with recommendations. Recommendations say, we're building new housing, but it's all luxury. You said you wanted better food quality. There'll be a Whole Foods. We're going to renovate the park. There'll be a dog run. I have a dog. I want a dog run. It's fine. It's fine. We want a people's dog run. And you know, this is a very sort of, I'm kind of like uncomplicating a complicated idea, just for the sake of going through saying a lot. But then what happens when the city comes with these recommendations is it starts a clock. And the clock is called a Euler process, a uniform land use review procedure. Basically, it's like the recommendation gets passed from one bureaucrat to the next bureaucrat to the community board, which has absolutely no power. They're just the yes men, to make recommendations to the councilman who votes yes or no, and people across this city, from Bushwick to East Harlem to Inwood, have gone as far as to chain themselves to the desks of councilmen to say, please vote no against this rezoning. And they go, yes. Till it gets to de Blasio's desk or the mayor's desk, and they say yes to the rezoning. And that's your Euler process. Once it begins, currently as it is, there is no right of refusal for the people. We can't stop it. It just steamrolls right over us. So Take Back the Bronx is involved in fighting or trying to delegitimize the Euler process. And it's a fight that it's happening across the city. In Brooklyn, there is Brooklyn Anti-Gentrification Network and Mi Casa No Es Su Casa, who's been doing this work. In Queens, there's Queens Neighborhood United, there's Queens Anti-Gentrification Project. In Harlem, we know Marina's not here today, but the East Harlem Preservation folks are added. Harlem Defense, Solidarity and Defense is added. People all across the city have been trying to do this work to really raise awareness about what happens when a rezoning passes. And I think that we're at the point, because of what Sam's saying, because of everything that Sam said today, where it's no longer something that can be ignored. Now, how do we bring this conversation into the arts? It's very important. So let's see. The Whitney got a whole new building. They moved. Now that's the Met Brewer. Now they're down in the meat packing, correct? Whole new fancy building. Right after that, MoMA has a whole new wing. MoMA's like the size of the Metropolitan Museum of Art now. I know because I worked there. Huge. Studio Museum of Harlem, brand new building. They don't get a pass. The black bourgeoisie and the black elite does not get a pass when they are displacing poor and working class black people. Yeah? The new museum just announced that they're getting a new building. So all these new buildings going up during a housing crisis for the arts. I didn't even mention the El Al Pastor, the shawarma that's the Hudson Yards of the Shed, right? Right? The only other conversation that we've been having in this city about the building of new buildings is the building of new jails. That should say something. That the arts are getting new buildings as jail construction. And that the same mouth, which I'm referring to Darren Walker of the Ford Foundation, who champions the arts, under the same breath champions the building of these new jails. I don't have to do that much work to link it, really. But I will, a little bit more if I still have time. Am I good still? Sorry, I talk a lot. Say a few more things about it. As an artist, I should say something, I do have an art practice. I'm known much less these days for my art practice and more for my big mouth, which is fine. It'll come, my IFA says that it'll come later for me. As an artist, I think a lot about subjects and spaces and the strategies of survival for those places and spaces and subjects that are under the threat of erasure. Something that I think a lot about. I happen to be what might be an anomaly these days, which is a native New Yorker. That is also like an artist with a capital A, if you believe in that kind of shit. It gives me a certain kind of vantage point that it either really pisses people off or makes people super empathetic. You see, everybody wants to come to New York because New York is like where you come if you're an artist, or Berlin, right? But New York is where you come. But when you come to New York, you're coming to a place where people already live, right? So art schools open up, thousands of kids rush in all bright-eyed and bushy-tailed about being the next Nicole Eisenman or whoever the hot new artist is of the day. We used to talk a lot about Jeff Koons when I was in school. I don't think he's the guy anymore. Kahinde, whatever. I think what that does, in a sense, is put someone like me in a place where I see how the arts are actually working directly or being weaponized to move into places directly where people are just trying to live. So raise your hand if you've had a beer in Bushwick before. Notice all the graffiti? Yeah? So for us, that's like a camouflage. It's a camouflaging of a violence that's happening, an erasure. Art galleries in the middle of you're a geographer. We call like the built environment, right? What do you need in a community? You have like, usually like there's like the laundromat, the bodega, what else? There's like the Chinese food spot. There's a check cashing place. For some reason, like Western Union, people need to send remittances back to their home countries, right?
Grocery store.
The C-Town, right? Art gallery. Art gallery. Why is there an art gallery in the middle of a poor working class neighborhood? Now, I've been accused when I say that of being against art, anti-art. Motherfucker, do you know how much money I spend on art supplies a month? Like, you ain't seen a bougier art nerd than me, you know? But it doesn't belong there. It doesn't belong there. Why? I'm gonna say that. I'm going to also say there should be a moratorium on all place-based arts projects across the city. Museums need to stay out of poor and working class neighborhoods, inquiring about anything. Why would I say such things as an artist? It has everything to do with the fact that museums are growing at the same rate that prisons are trying to grow, jails are trying to grow. It's a Trojan horse. The gaze is not for the community. It's there to change the stature of the community. It's a dog whistle for new settlers. It's a dog whistle for repopulation. It's what it is. It doesn't matter how well-intentioned the artists who show there are. The gallerists, the landlord, have a different plan for the space. See? When I first got out of grad school, the first art show that I was put into was a show by a group, a nonprofit organization called No Longer Empty. First, let's just think about the name of that. No Longer Empty. There was an old, gutted out night court in the middle of the Bronx. The courthouse was the courthouse that had been closed the year of the summer blackout of '77, which is the year that I was born. My mom was pregnant with me. There were so many people looting and shit that the cops had arrested. Everybody had to open the old night court and like shove people in there. My uncle was in there, so my mom had to go get him out. She was pregnant with me the last time she was in there. So I remember the opening, us talking about, she was like, wow, last time I was in here, I was pregnant with you. And now I'm looking at your art in here. And it was like nice. It was like a interesting moment, you know, because my work was really responding to the Bronxness. I'm a very Bronx person, you know, that history, like, you know, if you leave me alone long enough, I'll start beatboxing, you know. But, you know, that show, as part of like some of the programming, announced that they were going to have a tenant attraction broker party. And they were going to lay out a map, make maps for people and entrepreneurs interested in the area to come and attend and learn some things and talk to investors. You see? It's really clear. These are the chips that are on the table. And as artists, as people who see space aesthetically, or think about space aesthetically, I think that's a power that you have to see in that way. That gaze should then be turned to where you live, to deal with like the real things, because we all live here together. So we have to start thinking about how these things work together, maybe try to find the trap door. Angela Davis, she always says, she says that art and imagination are the most important things and that they must be nurtured and cared for. Because if the people lose their ability to imagine, we can't imagine our way out of oppression. We need new imagination to adjust, to pivot and bob and weave all of the bullshit of capitalism. I'll leave it there.
Yeah, my name is Georg Windeck. As Jeremy has introduced me, I'm an architect and I'm also an architectural historian. So I have had exposure, or do constantly have exposure to the topic of real estate, both through my professional practice working as an architect in New York City, but also through my research as an architectural historian and my teaching. And while both of you were talking, I was like thinking what would be the good transition for me to start my last and final contribution after the great things that you've all said. And I think that we can maybe start by saying that like everything that you have been talking about or alluding to always manifests itself somewhat like architecturally in the city. Like whether it's political processes, art galleries popping up, everything is in the end something that has a presence as a building, whether it's a reconfiguration of a building or a new building or the destruction of a building. It always like has to do with like architectural production somewhat. And maybe like to start off a little bit, what's been going through my mind with regards to the historical context, to contextualize the discussion. I mean, as an idea, real estate has probably been the most destructive force to the original concept of architecture ever. Because like when real estate was invented as an idea that was in England in the 18th century, please correct me if I'm wrong or if you have a different opinion, which was essentially a way of the British crown to avoid a revolution that had just happened in France. They wanted to avoid getting their heads chopped off, so land ownership was made accessible to broader range of the population that were not related to nobility but had financial means to get property. And that kind of idea, which kept the royal system in place but allowed for a liberal economy, has been in a certain way the first real estate state that emerged, and has been the model for all like capitalist development in the Western Hemisphere since then, and has prevailed actually much stronger so than the actual revolution, which happened in France, where just a few decades later it became totally autocratic system again, where cities were like chopped down, cutting boulevards to like poor neighborhoods, and like the middle way of like the English idea of, you know, give everybody a little bit of power, give everybody a little bit of money. That's where the term landlord actually comes from that time, that even if you're not descending from nobility, you can be a landlord if you own property. And that whole development led to an idea of buildings that completely broke with the tradition of what architecture always meant before. Because from that point on, you were thinking of a piece of land and the building that's standing on it as separate entities, as the building being a way of using this piece of land for a certain amount of time as it makes economically sense for the location of that piece of land, which was never before the case. Before that, always like architects were thinking of making a building as a permanent alteration of the landscape. As nothing, I mean, you would maybe be certain that it wouldn't like last forever, but you would not calculate when you put up a building that it would have to have a sufficient amount of revenue within X amount of years or decades. But you would build a building with the idea of it being there forever, and accordingly, and this is so important for like the history of architecture, accordingly it would also be put up with the amount of care and precision and dedication devoted to that concept of it being there forever. And you talk a little bit about like the highest and best use as an idea, which like means that in the real estate state, a building is essentially like a commodity, and it's an asset that's not mobile. Like in Italian, like banking in Italy, also in the 18th century, coined the term that you mainly use in Italian and German, other language. You say immobilie or immobiliare for real estate, which basically means non-mobile, so that you think of a building as an asset that cannot be moved, as opposed to a car, which is also an asset that can move around, or whatever else you can buy and invest with your money. And that idea has then, after being so incredibly destructive, also been a very generative force for architecture, because during the Industrial Revolution, which was really the time when the cities that we live in today were built the way that they were built, it has generated like a lot of beautiful buildings also. And like I was saying to Jeremy when we had a little chat about like this evening also, like at least I love New York City, and I'm sure I'm not the only one here. And the way that New York City is and the way New York City looks like is also like a product of a continuous reinvention and renewal and in an extreme form that generated like the urban landscape that we have here, and like even in neighborhoods that we would today think of as having beautiful old buildings, when you look at historic maps, you see that there were many really beautiful buildings taken down to build the beautiful buildings that you now consider to be old. Now, as an architect, being sort of like active in the process of renovating buildings, putting up new buildings, demolishing existing buildings, you're in New York, I think, confronted with a simply very extreme form of the real estate state, in a sense that you have a very entrepreneur-friendly environment, as you analyze in your book with all the effects that it has, combined with an enormous commercial pressure that is put on the production of buildings, and that is due to extreme profit margins that developers want to see before they invest into property. So when developers would have built like apartment buildings 100 years ago, let's say, just like for the sake of the argument, you would have calculations for how a building would be profitable that would span between 80 and 100 years. You know, it's something like at that point you would still think of building for the next generation, and there would be like a certain kind of like pride of ownership also, that like developers would live in the buildings that they put up, and it was often sort of like also part of an immigrant culture. Like I myself am from a family in Berlin that were like migrating in the 19th century, and then they worked hard, and then they put their money together and put up a tenement building. You know, that's what people did at the time. And like I think the difference now in the current architectural production is the anonymity of the investment, which completely dissociates the people that are putting up the buildings from from what's actually there. So corporations are being established, people put money in, they put up a building, they typically first get a realtor expert. So the architects actually don't have that much say. The realtors determine, in this neighborhood, is it good? You need X amount of one-bedroom apartment, you need this amount of three-bedroom apartments, you need these kinds of amenities. And then the architect is almost sort of like forced into this role of just like making the whole thing nice, rather than actually having an impact into the spatial configuration that you would want to give to the people that will live there, the neighborhood, the urban configuration, like everything that plays a part in what you really want to do as an architect. And then on top of that, you have the commercial pressure also forces a very cheap construction that like makes like these new buildings just like extremely flimsy and like having deficiencies pretty much like right after they're completed, where older buildings are just like have a much better substance and care. But these are all subjects that are very complex, I think, to condemn, because like the fact that construction costs are so high also has to do with like union regulations that allows construction workers to have a good pay, which was not the case 100 years ago when the beautiful historic buildings were put together by great Italian and Irish masons that were still trained in their home country, and they were putting up buildings for cents per hour. You know, so from that standpoint, it's a very like a complex thing to like, where I myself am also struggling with finding like the position. You know, what is here the right thing to do, and like what's the margin. But what's definitely, I think, a problem are these like extreme profit margins where developer want like 30% instantaneous like profit when the building is finished. Everything is pre-sold, and that's not good. So I think there's a chance for legislation to do something about that. What's I think interesting to see in the context of New York City relative to real estate development and the impact that it has on community are two hip it words of our day, which is A, green technology, and B, landmarks preservation. So like the Landmarks Preservation Commission, which is relatively young in New York City, has an enormous impact on how areas are being developed, and landmark status grants prestige, and it also gives access to public funding, but it actually also changes the dynamics of what these buildings are and what can be done with them. So for instance, like you mentioned Strand earlier, I was thinking the owner of Strand like owns the building that Strand is in, and it was very clearly stated and the building is in the process of maybe getting landmarked, and then Strand will have to close because the rules and regulations that would be imposed on the maintenance of the building, because it is a landmark, would be so difficult, like relative to the financing also, that that it would be like an impossible situation to deal with for the owner. So I'm not saying that landmarks is a bad thing. On the contrary, I think landmarks is great and important to preserve places and to also restore to the original beauty, like things that like really make the city a more wonderful place. But the practice of how like landmarks is being implemented is, I think, complex and needs to be looked at and evaluated further. The other thing that's interesting is that green technology is, especially in the real estate domain, like a huge marketing tool, and that's I think the United States Green Building Council, it's called, which like offers, like when you go through these courses, the LEED certifications, and also like I did that, I took the exam and all that. That's their realtors, like it's a real estate industry idea, which basically gives developers like the marketing tool to take down an old building and then put up a new building and like use up enormous amounts of primary energy to produce all the materials to put up the new building, creating an enormous amount of construction debris that needs to be cut off, and then you put some solar panels on the roof and you did something really great, you know, like as a mechanism. And I've been like really exposed to that myself because as a longtime faculty member of Cooper Union. It's exactly what Cooper Union did with their new academic building. That there was a historic building there, which was maybe not a total beauty, but it could have been transformed, but that was not in the interest of the real estate scheme that the president of the institution had in mind at the time. So a hugely expensive building was put up. It bankrupted the institution, so it had to introduce tuition. And there are some facade. It is ugly, and there's some facade panels that are controlled by motors that are connected to NASA satellites that predict how the weather. That's that sort of thing. But that's what people get excited about. That's what they want to hear. So obviously, ecological building is one of the most pressing tasks of our time from an ecological standpoint for architects. But again, the way in which these mechanisms and these ideas get used and abused within the real estate state is something to really sort of look into and say, wait a second, shouldn't we just leave it the way it is and maybe just repair it, and that being really the best thing that we can do for the environment and maybe also for the community. So I think that that's sort of a discussion that I'm interested in, and obviously these are all long discussions which we can't all elaborate on tonight, but that's one exposure that you have as an architect when it comes to real estate development in New York. And I think that the frustrating dimension of all that as an architect who essentially wants to build beautiful things that are good things and that do something good for the community is kind of when do you pull out? How far do you want to sort of participate in things that you can only partially stand up for, and when do you say, no, I don't want to have anything to do with that, and then someone else comes in and maybe makes something that's even worse than compared to what you maybe would have accomplished. That's I think the tension field from the architectural side that you're exposed to. But it's sort of I don't know what the exact recipe is. I just I grew up, and I was telling that to Jeremy also. I grew up in West Berlin, which was in the 70s and 80s, a heavily controlled, super rent controlled, hardcore regulations, and it was also very gray because of that, because nobody wanted to invest it. Nobody wanted to invest in the properties. Renters didn't want to invest because they were just renters. Building owners didn't want to invest because the regulations were so strict that they couldn't really make any profit. So there was no, whenever you would go to London, for instance, it was wow, everything's so beautiful here. So the real estate state is also beautiful in the sense that it creates care for the property, which you don't really have in a socialist environment, which I also was exposed to because I've seen Eastern Europe at a time where it was really still Eastern Europe. And in these kinds of environments, complete social equality and completely economical building for everybody was pursued with a scientific precision and rigor, they were really working on it hard, but the result was also we know how it looks, and it's also not exactly the city that you want to live in, when in terms of what it presents as an environment. So yeah, maybe those were just a few thoughts that were going through my head as I was listening to you, and maybe we can discuss it all together.
So I have a lot of questions myself, but I think maybe it's just good to start. I can pipe in anytime. But I think maybe I'll throw it to you all, with especially favoring undergrads, our SV students who want to kind of chime in. I think there's a lot on the table, so does anyone want to kind of brave the first question?
A few things about that. Most people I knew growing up, like my aunties, or they moved out of my grandmother's house at some point. They had their own apartments. The young 20-something-year-old who got their own apartment, all on their own, and got to live that life is like an extinct idea now. Most people I know in their 40s still live with roommates. There's a roommate economy in New York.
Mm-hmm.
It's like actually designed like that now. You go look at an apartment, if you even get shown the apartment, because there's also like the paywall, that is the inventory. And I'm not even talking about like new construction. I'm talking about that shitty old building in the neighborhood that once upon a time you just asked the super for the application and you got in, and now there's a property management, right, where you got to give like 3 years tax returns, credit check, a letter from your bank, a letter from your employer. Mm-hmm. This is like the building that I live in. My lease right now is in my mother's name because I didn't qualify.
Right. Yeah.
So I think that in terms of population density, I think it's exacerbated by the fact that New York is really build itself as in not B-U-I-L-D, but build as in B-I-L-L-E-D, as a college town. Mm. And they're shoving people into apartments. I've seen apartments where there's a wall, like a bullshit like sheetrock wall, right down the middle of a living room where there was a fireplace, and half the fireplace is in this side and half the fireplace is in this side, and it's like, and they want like $2,100 for that shit. Yeah. So I think that what the geographers might say. I've been hanging out with geographers for a while now. What the geographers might say is like, how does the built environment shape how we normalize shit? Even on the subway, you'll see an ad from Street Easy, and it's like, the ad is, sure, your window faces a brick wall, but behind that brick wall is New York City. So I think that if you've ever been to one of those old apartments out in the Grand Concourse or in the Washington Heights with the sunken in living rooms, and we used to have a lot of space, and it's actually the one thing that we've been robbed of the most in this city, is space. And with the memory, when the memory of like the people is gone, when we start to forget that through the generations, what's left is the memory of the roommate economy, and then that's all we're left with. And I think like the fight, I mentioned space for artists before, but I think that, I'm being very literal about the fight to get space back. I don't mean that as artists galvanizing at Tom Finkelpearl's office before he quits to say, we want artist studios. Clamoring for artist studios in the middle of a housing crisis is like asking for a second home, and to me, it's selfish. If you are making small paintings in your room, that's an honest reality. And are we all, I don't know, call me romantic, but aren't we as artists all trying to like deal with the truths of what our situation is? Maybe that's the closest and most honest artwork you're going to make, rather than clamoring at Finkelpearl's office for something so you can paint a mural-sized, or just tape the fucking banana on the wall and be done with it.
I have thoughts on that, but as an architect, do you want to?
No, why don't you?
Okay. Well, I was just thinking that I think both of these things are kind of true at the same time, and then what's actually going on is there's a bifurcation of the housing market, where like you do have these investment bankers or hotshot lawyers or whatever who are living by themselves in very large spaces, and then you also have a lot of other people who are crowded and will never have the opportunity to live on their own as things are going. So the problem, of course, is that the market is then skewed toward producing more housing for the investment banker rather than for all those people crowded into, smaller spaces. And the kind of policy solutions we've seen have been create more smaller apartments, micro apartments, right? As if like anybody's main complaint about New York City is that the apartments were too big. So then we're going to create these like tiny little shoeboxes, and everything's going to be on rails that will of course break immediately. And that's like the most creative solution that the planners have come up with, not because they can't think of anything better, but what the real estate industry will go for. And so that's like where the planning energy is then channeled. And of course, I mean, the other thing to think about is like, what was the density of Manhattan 100 years ago versus right now? It was phenomenally higher 100 years ago than it is now. And that wasn't good. It was, but we built out all this stuff, but we haven't actually figured it out. We've just given a lot more space to those who can afford it.
Right. But it's, I think, that's an more like a macroeconomical issue that for real estate developers in Manhattan in particular, but also in downtown Brooklyn, luxury residential is the only thing that really works. There are hardly any like office buildings going up anymore anywhere. Like especially like when you think of an area like Midtown, which is like traditionally like a business district, you have luxury residential buildings being built there because you don't need office buildings anymore in the electronic age in the way that you used to need them. Like you need representative spaces, boardrooms, things like that. That's what the banks still have, but you don't need like all the clerks and people that are doing, the actual work. You don't need them together anymore in the tower. They can sit in Jersey City in their cubicle or wherever you want to put them, and only like the representative functions are really staying in the city. And I think that's a big problem with like people often ask me, what do you think of these like super skinny tall towers? It's like architecturally you could debate whether you like what's good about them, what's bad about them. And New York has always been a city that's challenged like the known dimensions. The Woolworths building did the same thing, but like I think the big problem is really that like with the luxury residential construction is that it sucks the life out of the city on a whole like other scale, where people don't go there to work anymore. The streets are empty. Like it's just basically like increasing the unproductive emptiness and abundance of space. Mm-hmm. And like in London, especially like in Westminster and Mayfair and like these places, they actually have policies for special taxes for people that do not permanently stay there, because the local economy has suffered so much that restaurants are empty, stores are empty, like because nobody lives there, nobody goes there anymore. And I think that's like something that maybe like in New York City could also be something that could work for these kinds of environments.
I mean, in New York too, right? You go on 14th Street now, that's like shuttered shops.
Yeah,
the West Village.
Yeah. Absolutely, but I think that the tech industry like wants to be hip, and that's why the tech industry invests in property, in desirable urban locations, although they don't really need it, like for their business. Like it's not really like necessary, but they can afford it, like, and that's why they're doing it. And like the amenities are like extreme also, like like it's crazy. Like they have restaurants in these buildings to make sure that the employees don't go out too much and waste too much time, which is absurd because like that's why you would want to be like in an urban
in New York City
in order to but they love it. It's a crazy
slavery,
yeah.
basically.
Yeah, I mean, they're like company towns within one building.
Right. Yeah.
I mean, I write a lot in the book about what the presence of different industries does to the land economy in a city, and the presence of a large-scale manufacturing sector in New York really changed the kind of calculus of land and housing in the city. And the departure of those industries created a lot of space for real estate to kind of take over. And then now you see a certain form of so-called urbanists touting the tech industry as the thing that will re-diversify our economy and move us away from finance and real estate. But it seems to me that the tech industry has exactly the same relationship to real estate as finance does, and so it's not useful. But there was an argument that we should welcome Amazon for that reason, for example, that it would re-diversify our economy, but the only way we would do that apparently was by, an absurd amount of real estate speculation in Long Island City. So, it doesn't do the function of what manufacturing would have done, not only in terms of what they actually do, producing technology versus producing graphic arts or whatever, but also in their relationship to land and housing around them. Yeah, sure. I think we both have something. Yeah.
So I was looking at them a little bit, and what I can do is I actually printed them out before coming here because I figured that it would probably come up. So the TPA, or the Housing Stability and Tenant Protection Act, it actually accomplished a few things that I would say are like, reforms that we could deal with that can be useful. But, in the grand scheme of things, it really does just push things along. There's no real exchange of power. So some of the things that they have done that works out is pulled back some of the power of the Rent Guidelines Board, right? So basically, if you live in a rent stabilized apartment, whatever your last rent was is what the rent is going forward. And so, which is great because landlords have lost a little bit of power there with being able to jack up the rent. They have made it impossible, or not impossible, but they've made it very difficult for landlords to deregulate apartments. So there used to be a situation where they can, once you move out, they can flip it and make it a market rate apartment. And we saw that happening all over Brooklyn, right? Or if you live in a rent stabilized or rent controlled place, once you hit a market threshold, a certain amount, then it goes market rate. So they really like this flipping of apartments. For a while there, they were giving away Section 8 vouchers to people so that once people move in with their Section 8 vouchers, that would instantly make the apartments market rate. Because the rent, Section 8, what it does for those who don't know, is for people who are poor people who qualify for Section 8, they only pay 30% of the rent. And then HUD, which is a government entity, pays the rest of it, but it's market rate. So it turns the apartment market rate, right? So there's some limitations put on landlords for that. Caps on rent increases. So this thing about the preferential rent that they were doing before, that's out now. It says here, the practice of charging a tenant a preferential rent, a rent amount charged to a rent stabilized tenant that was lower than the legal registered rent, is no longer permitted. Under the TPA, the rent currently charged to a rent stabilized tenant, even if less than the legal registered rent, becomes the base rent of which the landlord may implement increases. In other words, like if I look at my lease, it says you pay $1,200, but this is your preferential rent, but your rent is really $1,460. So when they raise your rent, they raise it based on the $1,460, not the amount that you pay. See, so a little bullshit like that.
And they can't do that.
They can't do that anymore. So then there's this thing about converting rent-stabilized buildings to condominiums, which is a way that you're going to see landlords try to get out of all of these by just flipping the buildings and turning them into condos. But before, they had to get 15% of the people who live there to agree to buy. Now it's up 51%. So we got some wins here, you know? The other things that they did, which y'all are probably gonna love this, capped the security deposit at 1 month's rent. For a long time, a lot of us, they were doing 15% of the annual rent, right? Applications fees are including background checks. So background checks are still a thing, 20%. But landlord blacklists are out. Now, how they're going to actually enforce this, that's the problem. But a landlord blacklist basically meant that landlords were banning people if they've ever been to housing court before. That's everyone in New York, right? So this is now illegal. They can no longer ban people for having been to housing court before. How that's going to be enforced, who knows? There's also a lot of extensions given. So like, 3-day notice is now like a 5-day or 10-day notice. Like, judges now must consider the well-being of the tenant before evictions, and the school enrollment of children in the home before evictions. Nothing about, moratoriums on evictions so they're all reforms. They're all smart reforms that were desperately needed because that's how bad shit was, but reforms nonetheless. Let's see.
Can I say something just about the politics?
Sure. Sure.
One thought I have at least about the politics of this is that one interesting thing that's happened in New York over the last couple of years is it's suddenly become a political issue if you accept contributions from real estate. That wasn't really the thought, that people could run for office and say they wouldn't accept contributions from real estate. The idea that real estate money is corrupting and that being kind of an open matter of political debate is, I think, part of what has changed. So a lot of even the more middle of the road candidates who ran in like the no IDC state races, even they were kind of pressured not to take real estate money. And that is, I think, somewhat very new in New York City politics. Like, I think it's just like the idea that people would be under like pressure to renounce real estate money, I think is a great development, because what it meant is it just gave more room, more freedom of maneuver. Then on top of that, you also had a statewide tenants movement that's more, from what I understand, and people involved in the movement might know more than I do, but there's kind of statewide organization for the first time in New York tenant politics. And I think those two things together have really helped shift what's possible. And my sense about the laws is they do a lot to preserve the existing rent protections that were more or less being constantly violated. What then the question is like how to expand protections, et cetera.
Right, and so what you'll see here is like landlords wanting to challenge this and treating it like socialism has come. And so they're like challenging it based on like their property rights and dog whistling, saying that, well, there's no incentive now for landlords to repair buildings because we're not gonna get any increases. Like, it's so hard to increase the rents now that we're not gonna be able to repair buildings, and then there's no incentive to continue to develop. And so they're basically being like, it's gonna be the 1970s again, and New York is gonna go bankrupt because we're gonna pull our funds. So it always boils down to a class war. I would like every artist to try to go to the local Pentecostal church in their neighborhood and ask them to use some space. Where are the nooks? How can we share space together that doesn't involve some real estate developer inserting himself to then flip it to use you? You see? Like, I got an art show I'm planning. I was supposed to have it last month, but I haven't been really painting on time. At the chicken spot in my neighborhood, because you got a big ass wall, and I said, I'll paint a mural for you if you let me hang some work here quietly. no blast on Instagram. By invite only, come see the work, because I have to protect the space given the situation, given the context. But I think that however we decide to show each other our work, there's a power in withholding, especially when branding is every fucking thing. There's a power in withholding and choosing how you have your audience. So please, by all means, like, my favorite example is Paul Chan. When he quit art, which he's back to making art again. He opened Badlands Unlimited, and like a gentrifying ass nigga, like he went and he opened a publish. He got an office in Chinatown on Henry Street or Moscow Street, one of those over there. But what he did that was so interesting was that there was a 99-cent store right below him, so it was right above it. He sold his books out of the 99-cent store, so he had a publishing office right above, and you would go get your toothbrush, your Drano, and your TP, and a copy of Marcel Duchamp's late interviews, right? Integrated into the neighborhood. No extra bells and whistles needed. We actually have to align with the tenants in our neighborhoods and say, out, you're not part of this conversation. That's, I think, the gesture. It's not, and I'm not anti-art. You see, it's very easy to say that. It's very easy to say that. But in the Bronx, we had the Museum of Modern Art throw a party, and then the next week, new museum was there. Why the fuck is the MoMA and the new museum coming to the Bronx weeks apart from each other? Why? Because real estate is interested in the Bronx. That's the only reason why. I don't care how cool, I don't care how many locals were involved, and I don't care how smart the programming was. It doesn't matter. This is why we say a moratorium on all these kinds of things. If you really care about, if you really can see deeply, really see, then you understand the context of what's happening. And then how do we then adjust? Still make art. I still make art. Still make art. Still show each other our art. But keep things at bay. We just need to figure it out. You were gonna say something.
I was like, actually, I also when you were speaking earlier, I was a little perplexed when you used the sentence "art does not belong there," because I think this is something full disclosure, I don't think one should ever say that about anything.
See, and that's the thing, Georg. I'm sorry, that's the thing. It's like there is a conflation happening.
Yeah.
When I say art gallery, it's not artist or art.
No, you said specifically art does not belong there. That's like word by word.
Art is already there.
Finish my point?
Okay.
Art is already there. It's already there.
No, when there's an empty storefront and a gallery opens there, I don't think this is something that necessarily needs to be condemned. And I live in Harlem myself, and I'm part of these processes, and I witness them happening around me, and I consider myself.
You live in Harlem?
Yeah. And I consider myself also a poor artist who bought a place in a neighborhood where he could afford it. And that's I think part of city life. And I think that it's dangerous to polarize in the sense of saying, okay, yeah, the MoMA went there. Okay, yeah, I'm not a fan of the MoMA and what the MoMA is doing. And real estate is an enormous power that infiltrates all of society. I mean, St. Vincent's Hospital closed down, because they couldn't get the real estate deal that they wanted to get, because landmarks didn't allow them to demolish the 60s building with the inverted arches. I just think that the fact that art makes the place a better world and makes every place a better place should not be constricted by the fear of it potentially having something that could be perceived as positive by a real estate developer.
I wholeheartedly disagree with you, sir.
Then we disagree on that.
Should we not be worried that those empty storefronts exist, that so many empty storefronts exist and are
Yes, of course.
being why are businesses being driven away and why are there so many empty
Yeah, but that ties into macroeconomic processes that go beyond just real estate. We have to, in general, like figure out how to like reinvigorate urban life. Like,
But that's the
retail-
assumption that
retail
life
is-
is not already invigorated. This is what I'm saying. The
No,
art
no,
is
what-
already
what-
there.
what
There are many things happening.
No, no,
What's
retail is
happening is that
closing
it's
down
not
everywhere.
recognizable to you, Georg,
No, no.
or to other people.
No,
People
no.
are often doing cultural events and making
I know,
art that the
and I'm
neighborhood
there
and the
and I see
people
that.
in the neighborhood recognize and see. To put an art gallery, that's art. That's something else, and that's not. And an art gallery shows luxury objects to be sold to people who can afford it. That's what an art gallery is. That is not the same thing. To conflate that with art and artists is wrong. And that is the thing that continues to happen. When we say we don't want art galleries in our neighborhoods, we actually need other things. People say you are anti-art. Meanwhile, the neighborhood is peppered with artists. And I don't just mean MFAs and BFAs. I mean young MCs. I mean dancers. I mean like artists, people who make art, people from all over, from West Africa, Bangladesh, from Puebla, Mexico, that live in a neighborhood that are already artists. We already have art in these neighborhoods. And it's a very kind of like, I don't know, some settler colonial shit to assume otherwise.
It's really heavy
saw a
language.
couple.
I didn't say that. What I said is that like the LP's Land Parks Preservation Commission, in the way that it interacts with what's going on with real estate in the city is a complex issue. That's what I said. I didn't say it's a burden. You're misquoting me. And in the same way, I also said that the idea of ecological building and green technology is a complex issue relative to real estate development and how it's being used by the real estate industry for marketing industries. I didn't say that ecological building rules are a burden. Mm-hmm. So I'm sorry if that came across as too like negative. I was just like basically staking out the parameters that I, as an architect, am familiar with when it comes to the questions of like property development and architectural design.
So I think let's just go kind of along the line in reverse order. We'll give Sam the last word since he began. So Georg?
Yeah, I just
Wrap it
like
up.
think that I think we're at a really interesting point now because we're beginning to talk about the role of art in general, and like which is nice because like we're in the School of Visual Arts and like I think that like let me just basically say that it's I think it's important like to have a productive conversation and productive action about all the things that we've been talking about, not to polarize too strongly, because like what the role of art is in society and like what the commercial mechanisms are that are involved with the making and distribution of art is as complex as real estate. And as a matter of fact, real estate as a phenomenon like historically goes along with like modern art in which the artist is free to explore what he or she wants to do rather than producing for the single god that's being worshipped to in society. So that is like, it's a very complex subject, and I just cannot reiterate enough to condemn any form of artistic production, artistic representation, and artistic distribution holistically. And I think that like every artist has to figure out for him or herself for how to make a contribution to society and for how to survive, and like every artist should also have the freedom to go about that in the terms that he or she thinks is right and good for the community. So I think that's just like I think maybe all I want to say as a last word because we are here running late.
I mean, we kind of began with this thing about like the dilemma of being an artist within the context that Sam laid out and how to traverse that landscape, given these realities. As someone who was born and raised in the Bronx, Black and Puerto Rican descent, living in the community that I came from, I see the changes, and I understand how the market is weaponizing art. They're not just weaponizing young, bright-eyed, bushy-tailed BFAs and MFAs who moved here from Iowa. No shade, because it's not just rich kids. It's also middle-class, suburban, and poor kids that move here with dreams. It's complex. We don't want to vilify people who come here. That's not the point. We're mad at the structure, right? But we see the vilification. We see the changes. We see the weaponizing of the art, of the artist, for the market. That cannot be ignored. It's not just the artist. It's also, in the case of the Bronx, the hip hop origin story as marketing and selling the Bronx. So when Georg mentioned the landmarks preservation, I was thinking of World Heritage Site, which, while you might think would save a place, actually becomes a selling point. So it escalates the gentrification and the people who suffer of the people who are from that place, you see? So I stand firmly behind what I say when I say we do not want art galleries in our neighborhoods. We do not need them. We do not need a place that's going to open up and sell luxury goods. That is not the same thing to say we don't want art. The challenge for artists, if you love art, and you're not just trying to get signed to the next Zwirner deal, if you love art and this is what you want to do, and if you want to make those kinds of interventions, those intellectual and those poetic interventions that art makes, then you need to find a way to work in this terrain. And that is guerrilla warfare at this point. That's what I'm saying as an artist, and as an artist from this neighborhood. And from all the neighborhoods, I'm shouting it out. Fuck it. This is what the job is. How are you going to do that? There's no answer. But you know what? The best art provides questions and no answers. So there you go.
All right. We've been at it for over 2 hours, and we could easily go another 2. I think I can say all I want to say in 12 words. All right? If we want nice things, we have to decommodify land and housing.